3 months and it's still harder now. 3 months I've been living here without you now. 3 months, yeah. 3 months and oh, 3 months and I'm still breathing. 3 months and I still remember it. 3 months and wake up. Well, 3 months and I'm still sober. Picked all my weeds, but kept the flowers.
Hello, welcome to Keeping Our Schools and Communities Safe, a Worcester Public Schools school safety program. My name is Rob Pizzella, the Director of School Safety for the Worcester Public Schools. Throughout this school year, I'm going to be bringing a series of interviews to you from members in the community who are greatly affecting our schools and community in a very positive way. Our first interview for this school year are two very important gentlemen, both Jim DeRita and Jack Maroney, co-authors of The East Side of Addiction. Jim and Jack, I noticed you wrote a book called The East Side of Addiction, and I'm sure people are curious as to why you wrote this book.
Well, I think there's a long answer and a short answer, but I think it's important to preface it with saying that Jack and I both are people in long-term recovery and have been working in the field of treating substance use disorders, education around substance use disorders, and prevention of substance use disorders for the last 30 years. So in doing that, we meet and encounter an awful lot of people who struggle either directly or indirectly through their family members with substance use disorders or with addiction or substance abuse, whatever label you're comfortable with. And so after meeting so many of these people and listening to their stories and feeling their pain, one day Jack and I got together and thought, you know, we know something about this stuff through our own personal experiences because we're both in recovery for a long term, 30 years. And so we also have been educated and have been working in this field or in this industry. And so we thought, well, we should share that with people that seem to be lost and, you know, looking for some answers or looking for some support or for some direction or help. And so we started to sit down and do this. Prior to that, the long answer that I mentioned earlier is my wife, every time that she's gotten together with us, and we've been together for 30 years, whenever she comes away from any encounter with me and my friends, and Jack has been a friend of mine, as is Rob, for over 50 years, she always says to me, you have to write some of these stories. You can't just, you know, let those stories go. They're you know, they're too crazy. And so we always kind of had that, yeah, we should do that. But then, again, after having all of these encounters, it really became kind of solidified that, yeah, we really should do something to try to offer help. Because in recovery, what happens is you go anonymous, you know, you kind of meet with people in church basements and talk about addiction and recovery and all of that. But the outside world doesn't see it. What they see is the dark, pathological sickness of addiction. They don't see the hopeful, bright recovery part. And so that's what we really wanted to share with this book. So it's kind of a blending of all of those things, but that's really how it came to be, unless Jack wants to add a little something to that.
Thanks. Yeah, Jack, why'd you write the book?
Well, first of all, you have to like to write. And second, and most importantly, you have to have a story to tell. The liking to write part was easy for me. It was easy for Jimmy, but before I get too much further into it, I need to point out that our third co-author, Hank Grossi, who is no longer with us and whose picture is right down there in front, was the most reluctant. And if Hank was here, he'd say, I don't like to write, and I never wanted to write this story. But the reality is that we really felt we had a remarkable story to tell. And it wasn't a story about myself. It wasn't a story about Jim. It wasn't a story about Hank. It was a collective story about our neighborhood and all of us. And the remarkable piece about it is how many of us survived. And I think that is why Hank, Jim, and myself thought this is a remarkable story. This is something that we need to write. And I think that's why Sherry, Jim's wife, said, you have to write the story.
So Jim, obviously the audience now knows that this is an interview on substance abuse disorders, addiction, and recovery. And you and Jack, in full disclosures, said you're both in long-term recovery.
Right.
And so here we are. For generations, we obviously know that there's been a drug problem in society, not only here in the U.S., but worldwide. And but locally speaking, you and Jack decided to write this book because you wanted to bring a lot of attention to many issues, including what happens in neighborhoods when there are people growing up and they get involved in certain things, i.e. Substance use and abuse, addiction, and then the tragedies that go. I mean, there's a lot of good, bad, and ugly with substance use and abuse and addiction, and then for those who fortunately can't find a path to recovery. And so you've said you're in long-term recovery. So give us a little information as to what you mean by that.
Okay. Well, I mean, in order to get to that piece, my journey with substance use started when I was probably around 12, maybe even before that, seeing people around me in my community neighborhood that drank pretty heavily, and some, started to use drugs, and so the kind of curiosity, the appeal, the mystique was there. And so when I first got a chance to use alcohol, it immediately had a negative impact in my life. It wasn't a positive experience. And so for me, right from the start, there were warning signs, there were indicators that there was potential trouble on the horizon for me with substance use. And so I didn't pay any attention to those things and just kept on. And it started to progress and escalate to a point where it went from alcohol use to drugs, narcotics, and all of the above. And it just sort of took on a life of its own, and I started to become a slave to it, and every waking moment was devoted and dedicated to getting more of the substance that I needed, because there were a whole lot of underlying factors that I don't know if we want to get into here, but it wasn't coincidental. I didn't rely on substances out of coincidence or randomly. They did what I needed them to do. And so once that connection was made for me, that those substances, when I put them in my body, could alleviate whatever distress or discomfort that I was experiencing and make me feel good about myself, I was in. And I was in hook, line, and sinker for 20 years. And when the bottom fell out, and again, that's another huge, long story, but the bottom fell out and everything important in my life pretty much went away. And I was left broken and washed up on the shores of treatment or recovery, self-help programs, and that's where the journey of recovery started. So for 20 years, I was addicted and did everything and anything that I'm not proud of in order to obtain those substances that I needed. And for the last 32 years, I have been on a journey of recovery, thankfully with some people at my side to help me to not have to return back to that. So it's been a long, arduous journey for me, but it's been a wonderful journey of recovery, and that's what we wanted to share, because again, people see we're in the middle of an opiate crisis, as it's called, or epidemic. We see the pathological sickness, we see the deaths, we see the tragedies, we see the overdoses, we see people burying their children. What we don't see an awful lot is the hopeful, bright recovery side that Jack and I are both in recovery and doing things in our lives that are very productive and hopefully helpful to the community to contribute, to give something back. So it's been a long journey, but I'm not sure I would change any of it.
So Jack, in the book, These Side of Addiction, a lot of your stories go way back to the 60s, the 70s, 80s, and of course the 90s, and which means that you talk about addiction and opiate abuse way back then. And here we go, fast forward to today, and as recently as yesterday, I read in a local newspaper that a 27-year-old young man died. And in the obituary, the family disclosed that it was as a result of opiate addiction. So obviously we're getting more public information on this bad disease that we call it. Do you think things changed from when you in your era and others had become addicted to opiates and drugs, and here we are now and we're dealing with basically, it seems like the same issues, but maybe different outcomes we're expecting from it?
I think fundamentally, I want to say that the way things were then are pretty much the way things are now, except for one major difference, and I think that's the awareness. The courage that many families and people both in recovery and that are struggling with substance use disorders have in to be more open about what's going on in their lives. I think, you know, and one of the things we wrote about in the book is that one of our friends under 21 was one of the first ones in our neighborhood to overdose and die. And there was never any mention of drug use or any mention of anything like that. And in fact, I even believe that the cause of death was listed as something totally different than what it actually was. And I think that's the major advance, is the courage, I'll use that word again because I can't think of another one, to kind of come out and say, this is what's going on. Before, it was always in the shadows, it was always in the darkness, it was always something that no one wanted to talk about. In fact, back then, no one wanted to talk about almost anything. And today, I think that's a major difference, is the information that's shared out there, and I think it's a double-edged sword, is voluminous compared to what it used to be back then, where it seemed like everything was hidden under a veil of secrecy.
So Jim, you and Jack not only are in long-term recovery, but you're also professionally in the treatment field of a drug use and addiction. What would you tell, I mean, it seems that anybody that goes into recovery or struggles to get into recovery from addiction take a path that is somewhat different, but basically it seems that when someone's at a point in their lives where they want to get help, they want some type of treatment to hopefully get into a life of recovery, what would you recommend to a parent out there? I know both you and Jack are speaking before parents tonight, that their loved ones have been affected by substance use and abuse and addiction. And what message would you carry to the audience watching today about if they have someone that's struggling, what should they do to try to be the extra support that someone needs that is struggling with addiction?
I think probably the most important thing that anyone who is experiencing addiction in their family, with a loved one, a coworker, a friend, anyone, is to get educated. Understand what it is that addiction is, and also understand what recovery takes. You mentioned treatment. Treatment is wonderful. Treatment is usually where the journey begins, because most folks that are caught up or swept up in an addictive process don't have the ability to control when they won't use or when they will use, and so you have to break that stronghold or that grip, and we usually do that with detox, putting them in the hospital or some type of detox where we can, under medical supervision, we can start to break that grip, and then we start to educate. Addiction is a threefold illness that attacks the mind, body, spirit, and we have to treat all of those. We can't just biologically or physiologically clean someone up, sending them to detox, and expect that life is going to be wonderful again. Usually there's much, much more that needs to be done. So educating people, and Jack and I do an awful lot of that. We go around and speak to groups, we do conferences, we did one for the public school system to try to raise awareness. Jack mentioned raising awareness. Education and awareness raising is how we will figure this out in collaboration. There is no one agency or entity or individual who has all the answers and who's going to fix this problem. We need to understand it, we need to educate ourselves, and we need to come together collaboratively to the table to try to figure out what we do. So for anyone looking for any kind of help around, again, having a loved one or a friend or coworker or someone in your life who's addicted, is to seek some sort of understanding and education. And there are a lot of places you can get that. Learn to Cope is a wonderful organization that helps families, that helps parents who have loved ones or children who are addicted. There are a slew of other agencies, organizations that offer some type of treatment treatment, education, outreach. So the resources are there. And that, no one can tell me that the resources are not there. I know they're there. I've been doing this for over 30 years, and I know the resources are there. It's oftentimes difficult, though, navigating the system. And that's where people get kind of tripped up, and they don't know where to go. And so a starting point, I think it depends. You know, if you need a detox, that's where you start. If you need individual therapy or counseling, that's where you start. If you need an intervention, that's where you start. So there is no one cookie cutter answer that sort of is applicable to all situations, but getting some education and getting some professional help usually is where I would direct people. And I don't mean just help for the person who's addicted, but also help for yourself, because families get sucked into the vortex of this illness and become equally as sick as the individuals that are using the narcotics or the drugs or the alcohol. So it really is you know, you mentioned earlier on a sort of systems level approach, and we need to do that. For me, my whole training and graduate training has been in family systems theory and working with families, and so that's the approach that I use. It's the approach I'm most comfortable with.
Jack, we obviously, meaning the professional treatment community, substance abuse community, knows a lot about the disease of addiction, etc. There's a lot we don't know, because if we knew a lot, we would not have this epidemic on our hands right now facing the whole country. Your professional background is you've developed recovery centers where people go for treatment, including their families. One of the most perplexing things that we can't understand is chronic relapse. That people go into treatment, they come out, and then they relapse within a week, or they go back into treatment and they come out, and after some short-term recovery, relapse again. And that obviously triggers a approach and a reaction from families who have supported the addicted one and get frustrated, and you know, they provide all these resources and support, monetarily speaking, as well as emotionally. And then, you know, it comes to a point where after numerous attempts at treatment and recovery, they exhibit the tough love, saying, we can't support you anymore because you've been in and out of treatment and relapse, etc. We don't know what to do anymore. In your experience, I mean, do you think this is something that, you know, we need to continue to address and understand that relapse is common, and that, you know, we want to find the answers to where a person going to recovery for the first time and get it, but they don't, and then, you know, we want to be able to provide the proper resources?
You should ask Jim that tough question. The reality is that everything that you said, Rob, is so true, is that I think this is such a complex disease, and a disease that we don't have the answers to. And I think that in and of itself is frustrating for treatment providers. The relapses become frustrating for both treatment providers and for loved ones. I think one of the things, and I'm going to kind of borrow some of Jim's kind of rhetoric, is that, you know, knowledge is power, advocacy is very important, but also the understanding that this is not a short-term fixable disease. It really requires a longer-term solution. And I think, you know, we're looking at things and we're trying to borrow from areas and looking at things. So where is it working? What is working? And we look at these programs that are designed for, granted, for physicians and pilots and professionals, but they have a 5-year lifespan, and their success rates anywhere from 80 to 90%. So that's telling us something, is that these short-term kind of high failure kind of solutions are not working, and that we need to go to something that is long-term. The real key is how do we figure out how to manage that? How do we put the resources in place to manage some of that stuff? I mean, and how do we put the support in place? I think, you know, one of the things that I think we all can agree on is addiction is a disease of isolation. And how do we build those supports, both family and community supports around the person, to kind of ensure a higher degree of success?
So Jim, you were touching upon, as I told you, we're going to be speaking before some parents tonight relating to addiction. And a lot of our parents in public schools have sons or daughters or family members who who are addicted to drugs. They're not struggling, and as Jack started to say, addiction is isolation, but so isn't the affected ones. That, you know, we seem to, you know, we treat the addicted one, and they get help, and they get treatment, etc. Whereas the family members who had to, you know, put up with a lot of the strain and stress of addiction throughout the years of their loved one, don't tend to get treated. And when they don't get treated, they're just as sick as the addicted person. But lately there's been more and more resources for family members so they can cope with the fact that they're in a family situation with an addicted person. Give me something tangible. What's out there in the community that family members can you know, go to get the support that they need?
Okay. Well, I mean, there's not just the luxury of what's in the community, which there are plenty of resources in the community, but we nowadays, thanks to technology, have the additional benefit of online services. There's a slew of resources online that you can educate or get educated. There are some great documentaries that are out there. HBO did a wonderful series on addiction. It's a little outdated, but it's available. It's free. If you want to get educated and learn to cope, I think, for me, and Jack and I spent a lot of time going around and talking to the members of Learn to Cope. It's an organization that sort of bloomed from a woman whose son was addicted, and she was kind of frustrated and didn't know where to go, and started to find her own resources and people to talk to, and it just grew and developed into, I think we had some of their folks over the weekend in one of the family education things that I had just did this weekend. I think they mentioned they have like 26 chapters now. Started with one in the Brockton area. Now there's 26. They're in Florida. They're in the Midwest. They keep growing and growing. There's a reason for that. People find comfort in the connection, like Jack mentioned. Addiction is a sickness that isolates everybody. And so if one of the answers, I think, is about how do you reconnect? How do you come out of that dark, alone, painful place where addiction takes not just the individual that's using, but because of the shame, because of the stigma, it takes the whole family system there. Families don't want to openly talk about my son is in rehab or my daughter died of an overdose, or like Jack mentioned earlier, we're starting to see a change in that or a shift in that, or you mentioned it earlier, about people's obituaries now really listing the cause was a lifelong battle with addiction, things like that. So there's hope in that. Again, I think the more we take it out of these sort of shadows and out of the darkness into the light, we can all start to understand it differently. We can all start to understand it better and know what helps this family who are in trouble. Because the addict or the addicted person in the family may be off getting treatment, but as you say, Rob, it leaves everyone else just kind of on standby, you know, sitting home with the rosary beads, hoping and praying that this time it works. This time something miraculous happens. And so for us who have been doing this for a while, what we have come to learn is that you can't just isolate that one individual who's addicted and treat them and take care of them. You have to treat the whole family system. And there's varying ways that you do that, obviously. You don't need to send the whole family to detox, but you have to somehow engage them to try to help them repair the damage and not just come back together, but as Jack mentioned, learn how to, over the long haul, work out of this addictive process and into a recovery process. And that's hard. And it takes education and it takes support. And that's why those groups like, you know, there's Al-Anon, there's Learn to Cope, there's Nar-Anon, there's probably a bunch of other ones too. That's why they're so important and why they're so helpful, is people feel connected. People feel less isolated and alone. They're hearing from other people that are struggling with the same type of issues, feeling the same type of feelings, the frustration, the anger, the hopelessness, the fear that grips them. They're sharing and hearing now from other people that they too experience that. And they come together just like we refer people with addiction to self-help meetings like Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, groups like that, to do the same thing, to reconnect with others and to start to rebuild and to hear from other people that you're not alone. There's a bunch of us that have gone through it and we're here and we'll help you. You know, you don't have to do this by yourself. That, I think, is just so immensely powerful for families, for addicts who are trying to find recovery or trying to change. And so we need to help people understand those resources exist and where they are.
Thanks. Jack, so for a family or the community watching this program, a lot of them think that if someone goes into treatment and comes out, that they should be okay. They should be cured or they should not have any more problems. And I know we just talked about relapse, but what should a person do once they are getting out of some type of treatment program and they want to keep their recovery status? They want to be able to stay in recovery. Do you recommend that they just, go back to work and everything will be okay, or do you think there's other support mechanisms they need to keep their recovery?
Again, why do you always ask me the tough questions, Rob? But I would say, above all, what needs to happen first is we need to have a really good understanding of what that particular individual's needs are. And I think those needs will help kind of support what we hope to eventually have for everyone, is that's a long-term recovery plan. And I think that long-term recovery plan is multifaceted, and it includes a reunification with all that recovery has to offer, which is work, society, friends, family, all of that. I think one of the things that we wrote the book for was to really emphasize that for us, the fellowship of a 12-step program really had a significant impact on us, but there was a common thread that all of us shared, and that was the reunification of family, or having our own families, eventually getting back into the workforce and doing things that were important not only for us but for others also. So there are a number of layers that I think get to be accomplished over time. But being a treatment provider and being in this kind of field for a long period of time really has, kind of lessened my resolve in terms of, the efficacy of treatment. But I am now really kind of thinking that prevention, early intervention is more of the way to go. It kind of reminds me of the babies in the river story, where the town is looks outside and there's babies and they're in the river and they're drowning, and the townspeople go out and they're trying to save the babies, but there's not enough of townspeople out there and there's babies drowning, and one person starts running up the riverbank and they're saying, "Hey, where you going? Where you going?" And he's saying, "I'm trying to find out where the babies are coming from." And I think that's kind of where we really need to go at some point in time, is before we lose our youth to this tragedy that's happening more and more often, is really focus on why is this all happening? Where is this all coming from? So that we're not saving some and losing more, but we're preventing the loss entirely. I think oftentimes the real sad piece about a story of addiction that certainly manifests itself in all the negative ways that we're all too familiar is not only the pain and suffering from the person that has the actual illness themselves, but the damage that the family endures with that. So to kind of end that global suffering that we all have, we need to find ways to intervene and prevent some of the damage ahead of time.
Can I just dovetail on that for a second, because I think that's a great point, and I love that story, that analogy about going upstream. And what I wanted to add on to that is because it's so much harder when someone has a 20-year history of addiction to try to help them turn that around and treat that than it is to really put our resources into this preventative effort to try to avoid or deter that. We're pulling people out of the stream that are close to dead now, unless they are dead. And again, that's where Jack and I, we have constant ongoing conversations about this, is we need to focus. I mean, yes, it's important to do that, and we have to do that. We can't turn our backs and say, well, you're 54 years old, you've been doing this for 30 years, so, you're dispensable. We have to keep doing that, but at the same time, if that's all we're doing and we're neglecting the preventative efforts that Jack talked about, I think we're missing it. We're going to continue to be pulling bodies out of the stream. And for me, that gets really tiring. I've been doing this for 30 years and, have worked with some pretty difficult cases, and the relapse rate, if you will, is disheartening. And I think we need to look at a different approach. While we do this, I'm not saying do one to the exclusion of the other, but I think we need to do them both. And my sense or my feel is that we're kind of short shrifting the prevention side.
Well, you know, despite the increase in fatal overdoses being tenfold today than what it used to be, and the tragedy that we are now living in regards to the epidemic, there's a lot of good stuff going on in this community. I mean, District Attorney Joe Early has an opiate task force that he started over a year ago.
Yep.
And, you know, he's sending the message through going to various community forums to tell people, you know, how we can help as a community. City manager has been very proactive. He started programs under his jurisdiction. Just the three of us last week met with Chief of Police Steve Sargent. Mm-hmm. He has the Recovery Advocate program where police officers in a community policing way are going into the streets, and if they're encountering, you know, people that are overdosing or needing help as a result of having drugs on their possession, they're trying to get them into treatment versus arresting them. And so, you know, there is an attempt to continue to make a difference with this opiate epidemic and this drug issue that we continue to try to get our hands around. But what do you think in closing?
Well, I think the reality is we need to be doing more of that. We need to be doing more of this. We need to be offering real solutions. We need to be offering real case studies. We need to be offering all the things that we do so people see that there is a little bit of light instead of just the dark. You know, I just saw this morning on the TV at the gym, there's a city in Ohio where they're withholding Narcan from people that overdose. They're thinking of implementing a 3-strike policy on if this is your third overdose, then we won't give you Narcan again. So there's all these things going on that I think continue to cause us to spin in the mud. And I don't really see us getting a lot of traction in those types of interventions or initiatives. I think the education, the prevention, the resources need to be. There are inherent risks. I mean, for us to come out of that anonymous place and share our stories and to talk openly about this is hard to do. You know, Jack's a professional in the community. I'm a professional in the community. I work at a local college. It's not easy to say, here's my life story for everybody to see. My child, you know, my family. It's risky, but I think the benefits outweigh the risks. We have to be doing this. Otherwise, we're going to continue to pull people out of the stream, or we're going to continue to bury our youth. And for me, that's just unacceptable. We have the resources, we have the knowledge, we have all of these things that I think if we put them to work in the right place or the right places, then we can actually make some gains in preventing this and seeing a difference in this. In meeting with the police chief, the numbers that he showed us, the statistics that they keep or have kept over the last year for the number of opiate overdose calls they go on and the number that of those folks that die is staggering. It's on average probably 5 to 6 deaths a month due to opiate overdose, and probably close to 100 calls a month that they respond to. So it continues to grow while we continue to pull, you know, people out of the river or out of the stream and resuscitate them and save them if we're lucky. Meanwhile, all this other part of this sickness, it just grows, and we need to address that. So, and there are no easy answers. I wish there were, but there's not. But it takes all of this.
So, Jack, in keeping the issue alive and wanting to continue to make a difference in the lives of people relating to addiction and to a path of recovery, what do you think?
You know, on my way over, when I was driving over here, I'm saying, what's a good metaphor, what's a good analogy to really how to talk about addiction and everything else? And one of the things that came to mind, because we compare it to a lot of different things, and, you know, when I'm trying to say, what does it closely resemble in terms of, you know, negative impact on today's world and everything else, I came up with one thing, and that was obesity. And obesity is a challenge for us as a country, as is addiction. And it's not just about drug addiction. It's gambling addiction, it's sex addiction, it's eating disorders, it's cell phone addiction. I keep looking over at the couch where my cell phone is to make sure it's still there. And so it's rising to a percentage of the population that's much bigger than we even know. And I think it's there's an exclamation point being made with the overdoses and the deaths that occur from that. So I really think it's the tip of the iceberg, what we're now beginning to notice, in that we have an epidemic of national proportions, much like obesity, and that it's going to require a national effort. You know, I always said it takes a village to kind of really turn what has been kind of like a high tide coming in that we haven't found the solutions for. All this increase in suffering and increase in deaths and overdoses and all of that stuff, it's really going to require a significant effort and a recognition that we may need to go and revisit some of our traditional thinking, our traditional values and all of that, and tear it all down and really take a fresh approach and look at what we're doing and how effective is it.
So the book is The East Side of Addiction, co-authors Jack Maroney, Jim DeRita, and Henry Grassi. I want to thank the both of you for coming on the program. And on behalf of the Worcester Superintendent, Maureen Benender, this program, Keeping Our Schools and Communities Safe, I want to thank you for tuning in and stay tuned for more programs.
I don't ever wanna feel like I did that day. Take me to the place